Be seated. If you would go ahead and open up your Bibles, please, the book of Judges. We'll be looking again in Judges chapter 6. We'll look at verse 33 today. If you want to go ahead and find your way there. Mike's setting up the dry erase board for me. I got a different marker. That one was small and it was pink, and so those were two strikes against it. So I decided to grab a different one. But thank you for getting the marker and everything. Well, this week has been a busy week. How many folks, if you participated in Vacation Bible School this week, please stand up. If you participated in Vacation Bible School, please stand up. Excellent. Good job. Way to go. We had a great time in Vacation Bible School this week. Lots of opportunities to teach kids, to interact with them, and so I appreciate all the efforts that went forth this week in Vacation Bible School for those that prepared and those that led and those that brought food and everything else that went on. We had a great time through the course of this week. Well, today as we look in the book of Judges, chapter 6, we're going to start out by talking about something that many people don't like to talk about. I want to talk for a minute about math. How many of you love math? Let's ask the question that way. All right, excellent. There's a few brave souls that really just love math. My daughter is not a huge fan of math. She has a sign in her room, and it says, "Dear Math, I am not your therapist. Please solve your own problems." I think most of us can probably relate to that. And as we look into the Bible, we find something kind of interesting about math and God. And while this might sound heretical, I'm going to just put it out there. I don't know that God is very good at math, at least not the kind of math that we do, because his math just never seems to add up quite right. Like, let me give you a couple of, for instance, examples. So let's look at the first one, 2 plus 5. Let's see, we'll test our math skills. What is 2 plus 5? Well, that's the way we do math. 2 plus 5 is 7. But the way God does math, 2 plus 5 equals 12, because, the little boy had his lunch, right? And in his lunch, he had the 2 loaves and 5 fish, I always get it confused, 2 fish and 5 loaves. And what did they do? They brought back 12 basketfuls of leftovers, right? That doesn't compute in our mathematical equations. That doesn't work the way that we think it should work. Another, for instance, how about this? 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals what? 3. That's the way we do math, right? 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 3. But in the book of Daniel, whenever Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are put into the fiery furnace, then the king looks in and he goes, "How many people did we throw in that furnace? 3, king. Well, then why are there 4 walking around in there?" The math just doesn't seem to add up. Now, Peter gives us a little bit of a clue into this. I think it's in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. And 1,000, if you have 1,000 and you have 1 over here, right? That would be 1,000 is greater than 1, right? And that's the way we do math. 1,000 is greater than 1. Well, that's not what Peter tells us. No, that's not what it says. It says in Peter that it is 1,000 years is equal to 1 day in God's time. 1,000 equals to 1. None of this stuff makes sense mathematically to us, does it? All of this does not seem to compute. But God's math, the way that he looks at numbers, is very different than the way that we look at numbers. Today we're going to look in this story of Gideon, and we're going to see that Gideon was incredibly perplexed by God's math. He didn't really think the numbers added up right, and from our perspective, Gideon was correct. But we'll see that Gideon learns through this much about God's math, and as he learns about God's math, he learns about God's perspective. Now, to bring us up to speed, in case you slept since last week, maybe you did Vacation Bible School and you remember nothing else through last week, or perhaps you weren't here in the previous weeks, just to kind of get you up to speed, a quick synopsis, which is kind of like what they do on the television programs that you watch. And at the very beginning it says, previously on. So this is previously on the Unlikely series. We have Gideon, who was found threshing wheat in a wine press, who was hiding out from the Midianites, and the angel of the Lord comes to him and speaks to him, and he says, "Mighty man of valor. God is with you, mighty man of valor." And Gideon says, "What? Who? That's not me." And God says, "You're right, you're not yet, but that's who you will be because of me working through you." So Gideon processes that. We came back last week and we looked at the fact that before God could build an army, God had to tear down altars in the life of Gideon, in the life of Israel. The reason that Israel was in trouble, the reason that they were overwhelmed and oppressed, was because they had turned against God. So before the Midianites could be defeated, first, God had to defeat the hearts of Israel so they would turn fully and truly to God. So Gideon was called on to tear down the altar of Baal, to erect and build up an altar to God. And so that's what we saw last week. And as it ended last week, Gideon was somewhat in peril because the townspeople came and said, hey, let's just kill this guy because he tore down Baal's altar. Gideon's father stands up for him and says, okay, look, here's the deal. If Baal wants to kill him, then let Baal kill him. And so they gave him the name Jerubbaal, which means Baal contend. Let Baal contend with this guy. And as we talked about last week, Baal didn't kill him. And maybe the first day everyone was kind of stepping back from Gideon going, whoa, lightning's going to strike. He's going to get struck down right here, right now. But he didn't. And then a day followed, and then another day, and another day, and then a week. And then people said, you know what, maybe this God that Gideon's talking about, maybe this is the one true God. And so Israel's heart is turned back towards God. And as their heart turns towards God, God begins to do some amazing things. We'll pick up in Judges chapter 6, verse 33. Now all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east came together. They crossed the Jordan, and they encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon. Notice that Gideon does nothing on his own account. He does nothing and says, hey, God, could you come over here and bless this? Gideon only moves when the Spirit moves him. The Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called out to follow him. Now, this was the clan. This was his family, basically. And he also sent messengers throughout all of Manasseh. This was the tribe to which his clan belonged. And they too were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they went up to meet him. Now, these different groups, these were some of the different tribes in Israel. So Gideon, who was, at the beginning of our story, threshing wheat in a wine press, making no progress, doing nothing, cowardly, hiding, slinking, now all of a sudden, after this incredible event where he pulls down the altar, he gets this new nickname, Jerubbaal, and all of a sudden word begins to spread, wait a minute, God is going to do something through this guy. God is at work here. And so suddenly his family says, hey, if Gideon says we're going to battle, we're going to go battle. Then the tribe says, hey, if Gideon says it's time to battle, let's do it. And then other tribes begin to form. If this had happened a few weeks before, when Gideon was still threshing wheat in the wine press, if Gideon had just sent out a message and said, hey, everybody come, they would have said, who's Gideon? Who? What? Why? No, we're not coming. But now, because God is at work, because the Spirit is moving, because the people are turning their hearts back to God, suddenly a mighty army, or at least fairly mighty for Israel, begins together. So they come together to fight against the Midianites, the Amalekites, all the otherites, these cousins who come. And as you remember from our previous readings in chapter 6, these guys came and they basically just took all the food. They were like locusts. They just took everything, left a big mess and no food for the Israelites to clean up. So as we move ahead, you have this army gathering. But Gideon, as we've discovered already, kind of has these persistent battles with doubt. Now, of course, none of us can relate to that at all, can we? I mean, we never have any doubt. God calls us to something, and man, we just proceed full steam ahead. We never have any doubts, right? But just because it's here, we should probably go ahead and read it. Gideon had some doubts. Gideon says to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I'm laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there's dew on the fleece, look, Gideon's, you notice it's on the threshing floor. Gideon moved from the wine press. Now he's going out to the threshing floor. He's not afraid to go out there because of what God's doing in his life. He's going to lay a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there's dew on the fleece alone and it's dry on the ground, I will know that you will save Israel by my hand as you have said. And it was so. When he rose early the next morning and he squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. Then Gideon said to God, let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. Please let it be dry on the fleece, and on the ground around it let there be dew. And God did so that night, and it was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. This is the famous line. You might have heard it mentioned before, Gideon putting out a fleece, or putting out a fleece before God to confirm something that God is doing. Oftentimes this is utilized, at least in Christian circles, as this is kind of the right thing to do. You should put out a fleece to see if God is in it. Well, I'm not exactly sure that that's why this is included in the story. I don't necessarily think that this is a prescriptive narrative that's saying this is what you two should do. Because you notice as we look at this, it's really kind of crazy, and it's kind of the way we think. Notice what Gideon says to God. If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. It doesn't really even seem that there's ambiguity in Gideon's mind as to what God has said. God has revealed, God has spoken, and Gideon says, if you'll do it like you said you would, give me a sign. And actually, he says the same line each time he lays out his request. If you will do it as you have said. The reality is that God had already spoken to Gideon. There was really not any lack of certainty in Gideon as to what God said. The lack of certainty in Gideon, the doubt in Gideon was, will God do what he said? God, will you do what you said? Now, again, I know that none of you struggle with doubt ever. When God calls you to something, you just go full steam ahead and you never hesitate and never doubt. I'll confess, I know I'm the only one here, but at times I actually have a few doubts whenever God calls us, our family, into something, maybe the adoption stuff that we've been called into. And there have been, I'll confess, times along the journey that I said, is this really what God wants us to do? God, are you sure you're going to make this happen like you said it was going to happen? Are you sure this is the way it's going to work out? I've had instances where, in looking at different places where I was going to go to serve in ministry at churches, where we've said, okay, God, is this what you want to do? We're pretty sure this is what God you want us to do, but here we're going to set out a fleece, and you tell us and show us for sure, is this what God wants to do? Now, this, again, you probably don't need all this because you don't have any doubts, but if you do, here's what I've found in my life. What I've found in my life is that if I get to the point of putting the fleece on the ground, if I get to the point of saying, God, show me a sign, He's already shown me. It's really pretty clear. I'm just kind of looking for an out, typically. I mean, I remember when I was first feeling called to ministry, even before I surrendered to ministry, probably a couple of years before that, I was still in high school, and I was like, God, do you think you want me to do ministry? I don't know about that. Are you sure, God? And I remember coming up with some really interesting signs in my mind of, okay, God, if this is what you want me to do. We were visiting family. We were up hiking a mountain. If this is what you want me to do, let me see an eagle. Just fly over here. No eagle. Okay, God, I guess that's not what you want me to do. I mean, come on, an eagle. How hard is that? Just throw an eagle up there. Or God, if this is what you want me to do, help me to see this particular sign. And it didn't happen. Does that mean that God didn't want me to do it? No. God wanted me to quit playing around. He wanted me to act on what He had told me to do. I think that this is here not to show Gideon's faithfulness, but to reveal to us again the lack of faith that Gideon possessed. Remember, the Israelites at this point, they had just moved from, like days or maybe weeks before, moved from worshiping multiple gods, false gods, to turning back to worshiping Yahweh alone. Their faith was pretty suspect. It was kind of wobbly. And so Gideon here is being shown not necessarily as an example of what to do. Instead, I think he's being shown as an example of a lack of faith. But even in Gideon's lack of faith, God speaks. God does reveal this to him. He does encourage him. And then we'll see in a moment, God actually gives Gideon some encouragement before he even asks for it, because God wants to ensure Gideon's confidence. All right, let's continue to move on. Chapter 7, verse 1. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod, and the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. Now, I want to just kind of give you a little bit of a lay of the land, and we're just going to talk about numbers. I'm not drawing a map up here. Some of you don't really like, geography stuff. You're like, oh, no, he's going to draw a map. Well, I'm not going to draw a map because you wouldn't be able to read it anyway, because I can't draw very well. So here's just the numerical breakdown, which we'll see revealed a little bit further as we read, but let me just give it to you from the very beginning. Okay, on this side, and this is some estimates, and I don't know that it's ever stated explicitly, maybe other places in Scripture, there were approximately 135,000 Midianites, okay? So Gideon is assembling an army. He's assembling an army against the Midianites, Amalekites, all the other ites, and they have approximately 135 1,000 people. Now, Gideon sends out the call. He's filled by the Spirit. He sends messengers out, and they assemble, over here on Israel's side of the ledger, approximately 32,000 people. Which, if you consider the fact that Israel wasn't really working together in tribes at that time, the fact that they were able to assemble that many people, that's not bad. But if you compare that to the Midianites who were over on the other side of the battlefield, that's really, really bad. I mean, if you're choosing to go into battle and you say, okay, you can be on this army or you can be on this army, which army are you choosing? 100 times out of 100, I'm going with these guys. 135,000, I can hide in the back. No one will see me, right? That's exactly what's going on here. So here is what we see. Gideon, and I just imagine, sometimes I use my imagination maybe too much, but I imagine Gideon like preparing to go to pray, and he's assembled his army, he's sent out some messengers, they've counted the army, he comes back and we got 32,000, Gideon. Gideon goes to the spies and he goes, how many people do they have? 135,000. Gideon says, we need more people. We need more people. So Gideon is going to God, and he's preparing. He's saying, okay, God, I need to talk to God. I'm going to tell God, he's going to use good King James English. I beseech ye, therefore, by the mercies that you will please in your great wisdom, sovereignty, send to us more people. So on his way to speak to God, God speaks to him. Gideon says, great. God already knows what's going on. So the Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give to the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel boast over me. Gideon said, whoa, hold on, excuse me. I thought you said there were too many. Let's review the math, God. There are 135,000 of them. There are 32,000 of us. Too many? God, I'm not sure about your math here. But what does God say? There are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Now therefore, proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. Then 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. Now, there's a lot of really crazy stuff going on here. And I imagine that in Gideon's mind, a lot of really crazy things were going on, right? You want me to reduce my army, but look at the command. This is funny to me. At the end of verse, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home. Like, what kind of instruction is that? We're going into battle. There is 32,000 of us and 135,000 of them. If anybody's afraid, you can go home. Like, is this a test to see who's not stupid? Like, okay, we're going to reduce it. And it winds up 22,000 of them leave, right? So we can reduce that by 22,000. And you're left with 10,000. 10,000 not very smart people. There's a huge army over there. We've got a kind of small army in comparison. And now a lot of people are leaving. I mean, even if I thought, no, I'm brave, I'm not going home. When everybody started leaving, I said, I'm not brave, I'm going home. I'm checking out of this. Now, why would, the phrasing here is interesting. This is where the Bible, sometimes we catch things if we look closely. The phrasing, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away. Now, if you want to turn with me back into the book of Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 1 through 8. I'm going to read from this, and you can listen or you can turn back there if you want. But the funny thing about the phrasing is that this actually was not something special for this particular situation. It wasn't like God just pulled this out of his hat and said, hey, let anybody who's afraid go home. This was actually the policy, if you will. If you go back into Deuteronomy, we're looking at the law. This was the policy of how Israel was to do battle. And in Deuteronomy chapter 20, this is just the laws concerning warfare. Like when you go to war, here's what you do. When you go out to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and army larger than your own, sounds like God knew this was going to happen. You shall not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. When you draw near to the battle, the priest shall come forward and speak to the people, and shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you're drawing near for battle against your enemies. Let not your heart faint. Do not fear or panic or be in dread. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight against you, against your enemies, to give you the victory. Then the officers, now after the pep talk by the priests, after they say, don't be afraid, no big deal, God's on your side. Then after that pep talk by the priest, the officers shall speak to the people saying, Is there any man who's built a new house and has not dedicated it? Let him go back to the house, lest he die in battle, and another man get to dedicate it. Any man who's planted a vineyard and has not enjoyed its fruit, let him go back to his house, lest he die in the battle, and another man gets to enjoy it. Is there any man who is betrothed to a wife and has not taken her? Let him go back, lest he die in battle, and another man take her. The officer shall say, Is any man fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go back to his house, lest the heart of his fellows melt like his own. So this was not just for Gideon's particular situation, this was Israelite plan of battle. This was policy. Okay, once we're about to go into battle, now we do the little fear test. Anybody that's afraid, you can head out. If you got, your wife, you just got married, or you didn't get married, go ahead and go back if you need to. I mean, that's a lot of reasons to go back. That's a lot of loopholes, is it not? It's almost as if God didn't want people in his army. And maybe that's exactly the case, because look at verse 4 of Deuteronomy chapter 20. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you the victory. What is all of this about? Back in Deuteronomy, and then also here as we're looking at in Judges, what is all of this about? It's saying, you need to depend on me. Israel, do you trust in me? It's God saying to his children, do you trust me? Do you trust that I can win this? Do you trust that I'm more powerful than whatever army you face? Do you trust me? This is God drawing his people back to the covenant. He didn't just throw out these words, hey, if you're afraid, go back. He's reiterating once again, look, we had an agreement. We were going to work together in this. If you trust me, I'll win the battle for you. So he reverts them back to the covenant, the policies, the agreement that they had as a people. And he says, if you're afraid, go ahead and head out. So, as we've already seen, 22,000 of the people returned and 10,000 remained. That's actually a little reverse math as to how we got to the 32 originally. So we have 10,000 really stupid people there that don't recognize that 135,000 is a lot of people. So now Gideon, remember, he was going to go ask God for more people, at least in my imagination. And instead God says, hey, you've got too many. They go home. As Gideon watches them leave, he's thinking, we're going to get whipped. We're in such trouble. Have you ever stepped out, have you ever played in some kind of athletic event? And as you step onto the field, court, whatever it may be, you think, we're about to get killed. They are going to clean our clocks. You know just that sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach, like, there is no possible way we win this thing. That's exactly where Gideon was. Now, his other 10,000 people, apparently they're just stupid and happy, and they're going, yeah, we got this, man. Gideon is like, no way, this is bad news. Gideon, I think, is probably about to go back to God and say, okay, wait. You took away too many. We really need some help here. I mean, if you did some quick math, some of you people that actually like math, I mean, this is like 10,000 of them, 135. I mean, each one of these 10,000 is going to have to take out a lot of their guys to even come close. So Gideon's about to go back and ask for more people. But instead, in verse 4, the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. God is horrible at math. The people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. Any one of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, shall go with you. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, shall not go. This is all pretty clear. So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. So the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouth, like this, was 300. But the rest of the people knelt down to drink the water. All right, so we've got some more math going on here. Now you have your 10,000 people, and this 10,000 is divided up into two groups. You have your 9,700 and your 300. So the 9,700 are the folks who go down to the stream and just throw their face in it to get some water. The 300 are the folks who bend down like this and bring the water up to their mouth and they drink like this. Now, I've heard this told and taught and discussed two different ways. One way to discuss this is to say, well, you know what, those folks that bent down like this and pulled the water up to their mouth, they were keeping their eye out for the enemy. Like they were the good soldiers because they were keeping their eye out for the enemy. So God was weeding it down to the really good soldiers. Based on everything else we've read, does that make any sense at all? Yes, God wanted the really good soldiers so that the 300 could beat the 135,000. Yes, that's a great plan. Another way I've heard it explained, which I kind of agree with a little bit more, is that the people who dove face down in the water was because they were so tired and worn out because they had worked hard and they needed a drink like right then. The 300 who came up and just kind of casually bent down and picked the water up, well, they hadn't really been working hard. They were the stragglers and the lazy people. So the stragglers and the lazy people are drinking the water like this, and God says, take that group. Gideon says, wait a minute. Haven't gotten any work out of these guys at all. And this is the bunch we're going with? We have a choice here. Like Gideon probably, as the group was divided up, he said, you can have those 300. They weren't going to do anything anyway. And he's thinking, 9,700 versus 10,000? Who cares? Whatever. Take them. And then God says, take the 300. And Gideon says, what? Are you kidding me, God? You want me to go into battle with these 300 slackers? This is the plan. This is God's plan that he has in store, because God's math is different than our math. In verse 7, the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go, every man to his home. So the people took provisions in their hands and the trumpets. And he sent all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, and retained the 300 men. The men and the camp of Gideon was below him in the valley. Now, I'm just going to insert here that the order of this is probably pretty important. Because if he had first narrowed it down to 300 and then he said, who's afraid? Surely those 300 guys would have had a good enough sense to say, I am afraid. Send me home. Like those 300 guys, as they're watching everybody leave, go, where are they going? How come we're the only ones left? Like there's only 300 of them against 135,000. The odds are not in their favor. So Gideon, God expects, is having some confidence doubt issues. So that same night in verse 9, the Lord said to him, arise, go against the camp, for I have given it to your hand. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant. If you're afraid to go down. Yeah. If we're afraid, there's 300 of us and there's 135,000 of them. Yeah, I'm a little bit afraid, God. And you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went down with Purah his servant to the outposts of the armed men who were in the camp, and the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance. Their camels were without number, as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. When Gideon came, behold, a man was telling a dream to his comrade, and he said, behold, I dreamed a dream, and behold, there's a lot of beholds in there. A cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian, and came to the tent and struck it so that it fell and turned it upside down, so the tent lay flat. And his comrade answered, here's the interpretation of the dream. This is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given it into his hands, Midian and all the camp. So Gideon sneaks down into the Midianite camp, he and his servant, so they can see what they're thinking. And here's what they're thinking. They have had a dream, and this one guy interprets the dream and says, Gideon is going to smash us. Now, I don't know what was going on with this guy. I mean, he's looking across the valley going, look, more of them are leaving. More of them are leaving. Wow, there's only 300 of them. They're going to kill us. I don't know where you get this interpretation other than God gave it to him to reassure Gideon so that Gideon would have the confidence and the courage to lead the people into battle as God had commanded. So God works in the mind of this Midianite, not a follower of God, in order to work in the life of Gideon and the nation of Israel. So now Gideon has no excuse. So as soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshiped God. He returned, probably quietly because he was still in their camp. But then he returned to the camp of Israel. You can worship quietly too. He returned to the camp of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord has given the host of Midian into your hand. He divided the 300 men into 3 companies, 100 each, just a little math there. Put trumpets into the hands of all of them with empty jars and torches inside the jars. And he said to them, look at me and do likewise. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then blow the trumpets also on every side of the camp and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. Now, we read this, and it's interesting because sometimes when we retell these stories, particularly when we retell them to children, we kind of retell them and we leave out some important components, you know? Like we retell these stories and we're like, these 300 people were brave and they went up against all of these people. And then there was this great battle plan with I remember drawing, I don't know if you do, I remember like in Sunday school drawing pictures of like torches and the pots over the torches and all that. I don't even know, how would you put a pot over a torch and it stay lit? I'm not sure about that. But anyway, I remember those sort of things specifically about this story. But the really big part of the story that I don't remember so much of was that it was all about God. Like, if you look at this battle plan, it's not like the people who teach at West Point are going, okay, this is the way that you should conduct battle. You should narrow your army down to a fraction of what your opponent has, and then go get some torches and trumpets. No, this is not what any military commander anywhere tells you to do. All of this is designed to show God's glory and God's might and God's power. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when they had just set the watch. And they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. Then the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars. They held in their left hands the torches and in their right hands the trumpets to blow. And they cried out, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. They cried out and they fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. This is referring to the Midianites, Amalekites, and all the otherites. And the army fled as far as Bethshittah towards Zerah, as far as the border of Abel-Meholah by Tabbath. And the men of Israel were called out from Naphtali and from Asher and from all Manasseh, and they pursued after Midian. Now again, if you think, well, this was a really great strategy, usually only the captains had trumpets and torches, so they really faked them out, and they pretended that they had a lot more people than they did. No. It was all God. I mean, God tells them, okay, you go do something really silly and ridiculous, and I'm going to win the victory. Like, basically it is, you go stand outside the camp, and you go dance around with trumpets, and I'm going to win the victory. And this is kind of like the Battle of Jericho. Go march around it 7 times, the walls are going to fall down. Okay. I mean, basically that's what the people are, okay, God, we'll do what you say. This makes no sense, but we'll do it. And look at the army. I mean, if you say, well, they were confused, they thought there were a lot of people. If you're confused, like the Midianites, Amalekites, and all the otherites, you're in your camp, you hear a bunch of trumpets, and you see a bunch of lights. If you're confused and you think you're surrounded, what's your natural reaction? Your natural reaction is not, I better get my sword and kill the guy beside me. Woo, I'm taking him out before he gets me. I mean, that's not the way. I don't think in military training, if you're surrounded, kill your comrade. No, that's not the way it goes. Why did they do that? Because the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. The Israelites didn't even have to fight. They didn't have to pick up their sword. They just had to chase them. They were chasing them. They said, well, hey, go get some of those other guys we sent home because we're still chasing them. And there's so many of them to chase. But all of this is pointing towards God's power and God's ability of what he can do even in the midst of overwhelming odds. 300 versus 135,000. And once it got to that point, God said, that's about right. Yeah, that's probably about good. And God wins this incredible victory. To finish out the chapter in verse 24, Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites, capture the waters against them, so far as Beth-barah and also to the Jordan. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they captured the waters as far as Beth-barah and also the Jordan. They captured the 2 princes of Midian, Orab and Zeb. They killed Orab at the rock of Orab, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. Then they pursued Midian, and they brought the heads of Orab and Zeb to Gideon across the Jordan. Usually when you're retelling this story with kids, you leave out the part about bringing heads back. That's usually a part that you just kind of, we overlook that part. But notice where they killed Zeb at. That's really the main reason I read those last few verses. At the winepress. Where did this whole thing start? The winepress. God speaks to Gideon at a winepress. And then at the end, when they win the victory over the Midianite kings, they kill the king at the winepress. God works in incredible ways through his people. God's math rarely ever makes sense in our minds. Rarely ever do we hear God's plan and go, oh, yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, whenever God spoke to us about adoption and said, okay, you've got 4 kids, we're going to add 2 more to fill out your table, and we went, okay, really? We're good with 4? Like, four's a nice number. Or very logically, like Kinsey, you say, hey, can we just get a smaller table? Right? But that's not the way God's math works. It goes against our preconceptions and our ideas and our understandings. A couple things that we learned from this just to take away. We should never limit what God can do to the resources that we can see. We should never limit what God can do to the resources that we can see. If we look around at our church, we look around and we see who we are, and there's great people, talented people. We're not huge in number, right? There are other churches that are bigger. There are other churches that are bigger, much bigger in our city. But God can work through his people. The number is insignificant. The important part is what God can do with those people. The variable in all of these equations, the reason that all those equations added up correctly in God's math before, the variable that was changed is that God was added. Like 300 never beats 135,000, not even in Hollywood. I mean, think about it. The movie 300, they lose. 300 never beats 135,000. What changes in the variable? God is inserted. When God is a part of the equation, then it's incredible what victories can be won. We should never overlook or underestimate what God can do based on the resources that we can see. God is not limited. God is unlimited. The Bible tells us that He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Sometimes I believe that as God's people, we box God in and we say, okay, God, we can only do this much because this is what we have. Like these are the resources that we have. I think God would reply to us, well, who said that you're limited to the resources you have? If we think about the resources God has, well, that's a completely different equation, isn't it? Those are completely different things that we can accomplish according to His resources that are available. You see, God can do unlimited things because God is unlimited. He is, as we learned in Vacation Bible School this week, He is all-powerful. That means He's more powerful than any superheroes. That means He is like all the superheroes piled into one and bigger than that. God is all-powerful, and He can do anything in and through us. I heard a guy say one time that whenever we look at what God can do at His resources, that we have to recognize that God gives us a blank check. Right? He gives us a blank check to use that is unlimited. That's God's power. That's His ability. That's what we see in His actions here in the 300 overthrowing the 135,000. So the first thing is that we should never limit what God can do to the resources we can see. And the second thing to take away from this is that God can work through the remnant when they have faith and obedience. God will do incredible things through His people when they are faithful and obedient. See, sometimes, again, as we misread stories and narratives, if we just jumped in at chapter 7 and we had left off the first two parts, we would really be missing something, wouldn't we? I mean, if we left off what we talked about last week, that the nation of Israel had to tear down altars that were in their own backyard, in their own hometown, so that God could work. Before God could build an army, He had to destroy the altar. See, the mistaken assumption, I believe, for many Christians, for many believers, is that we say, you know what? I'm a Christian. God's on my side. Well, no, not exactly. As Christians, we have to put ourselves on God's side. It's not just that, hey, I'm going to accomplish whatever I want to accomplish and God's going to come and allow it to happen. No, God's going to accomplish whatever He wants to accomplish and we're going to join Him in it. You see how there's a distinction in that? We don't sit on our own power and say, hey, as a church, we're going to begin praying that God will do X, Y, and Z. Well, we can pray that way. That's okay. But what we really need to pray is say, God, what are You doing and how can we be involved in what You're doing? Gideon did not go to God and say, God, I think it'd be really cool if I could beat the Midianites with 300 people. What do you think? No. It took us 3 weeks of sermons to get to the point where Gideon would say, okay, I'll give it a try. He didn't want to do it. He went kicking and screaming into it. Because if Gideon had started asking and making requests, what would Gideon have asked for? He would have said, God, do you think that maybe the Midianites could maybe not see this field that I planted so that my family could have a little bit of food? Right? I mean, that's all that Gideon would have asked for probably. I think sometimes our prayers are so small because we're just asking God to come and bless what we're doing over here. But God has much bigger, grander scale plans. And He says, you know what? I'm not coming to join you. You come join me. You come work with me in what I'm doing. Join my army. You see, it's not that God comes to join our army. We go join His. The variable in the equation, as I talked about a moment ago, is God being inserted into all of this math. We go and join what God is doing, and there's no limit to what can take place. It's kind of like in the book of Joshua, before they go into Jericho. Joshua is approached. This is right after Joshua has taken leadership from Moses. There's an angel that comes and speaks to Joshua. And before Joshua knows who he is, he's like, hey, are you on my side or not? He says to the angel. And the angel says, I'm not on anybody's side. But basically, paraphrase, if you want to, you can get on my side. See, God when God comes to us, we don't say, hey, God, you're on my side, right? Come over here. Look, here's some things I want to do. Come over here. This is really cool. No. God says, this is my side. You come join me and be active in it. This is the message that I believe we must take away from this story. This was an incredibly unlikely army. And this unlikely army wins an unlikely victory. And the whole reason behind it is because of their all-powerful God. If we want to be an unlikely army, if we want to win unlikely victories, we must put our entire trust and our faith in this all-powerful, incredible God. Because it's only then that we can experience the victories that God has in store for us. It's only then that we can see Him do incredible, amazing things, far more than what we could ever ask or imagine. So our challenge is as a church, as individuals, that we would put our trust and our faith fully in God. That we would say, okay, God, we'll do it. This doesn't seem to make much sense at all, but okay, we'll do it. We'll follow you. We'll be obedient. And when we do that, there's no limit to what God can accomplish. Let's go to the Lord in prayer together.